From the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture.
That's just a little blurb when we go on here.
Okay, I think we're good. We're rolling.
Today is Friday, the 23rd of September, 2011. My name is Joe Mosnier of the Southern Oral History Program at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I am in Amherst, Massachusetts, on the campus of the University of Massachusetts in New Africa House with John Bishop, our project videographer, to do an oral history for the Civil Rights History Project, which is a joint undertaking of the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture and the Library of Congress. And we are privileged today to be with Dr. William Lamar Strickland, who has taught here for many years, and long before that, deep engagement in the movement in a whole host of capacities that we'll discuss today. Dr. Strickland, it's a pleasure.
Bill,
it's a privilege and a pleasure to sit down with you.
Thanks
very much. Just a quick note before we dive into the interview. Our videographer John Bishop was long personal acquaintance with Worth Long, and before we turned on, we were chatting a little bit about a mention of Worth, and I thought maybe we'd just ask you to lay that down here so we don't miss it.
Okay, well, I assume people know Worth was regarded as the poet of SNCC, and for some strange reason, there's a quote that's been attributed to Stokely, which actually was Worth's quote, and it was, quote, "False-faced America, we have found you out," unquote.
Thank you.
That sounds like Worth.
Bill, let me have you begin today with just recalling your family and your parents and how you, just coming up in Roxbury, and how you found your way kind of out of that context, say, to Boston Latin.
Wow. Well, it was elementary school. I had a teacher who thought I should apply to Latin school, and Latin school had a procedure where they would let you in based on your grades, and then as you sat in the auditorium, they would tell you, look to your left and look to your right, because at the time Latin school was all boys, of course, 1635, they're not going to be here at the end. So you enter in class 6, which is the 7th grade, because we had 6 years of Latin, and that was correct. Almost 700 guys started out, and we graduated about 220, 230, of whom 6 of us were black.
Tell me, if you would, some recollections of your parents.
Oh, my father was killed in the war, and my mother was worked for Raytheon. She worked the union for Raytheons, but I had aunts in Roxbury, and fabulous aunts in Newark, New Jersey, and my mother's family was from Georgia. So as a child, I would go to visit them in Georgia. In fact, it a little town outside of Macon called Haddock, Georgia. I later found out. I guess it was my great grandmother was the offspring of a plantation owner, and because the town between Macon and Haddock was a town called Gray, and the plantation owner was evidently a major figure in Georgia during the Confederacy, Madison Gray. And my uncle was named after him, Gray. But evidently, this was a fairly, I guess, open-minded, because he left part of his land to my mother's family. So that was the land that they had when I went as a child to visit them in Georgia.
Which branch of service?
Marine Corps.
For your father, the Marines?
Oh no, he was in the Army. Yeah. I was in the Marine Corps.
Yeah.
Yeah.
killed where?
Oh, God. I think in the Italian campaign. Yeah.
You've written in certain places about kind of part of the family and community world you grew up in Roxbury, and it included, obviously, through, I think, a cousin of yours and early acquaintance with Malcolm Little. Yeah.
Yes, I just recently wrote about it. Tried to recapitulate that, because there's been a recent biography of Malcolm X, to which I take great exception, and I wanted to establish that my recollections came from personal experience and not from secondhand experience, because I met Malcolm when I was very young, because he was a very good friend of my cousin, whom I say in the article was my hero, because I would be at my aunt and uncle's house, and girls would call him from New York, and I thought that was the coolest thing, was the coolest thing. So I wanted to grow up and be exactly like him. But they also were part of a group which on later reflection, I think may have been significantly West Indian, because my cousin his father was Barbadian. The Uncle Jake was his name, Jake Edmond, and my relatives claim that at some point in my youth, I said that Uncle Jake, I called Uncle Jake the man too mean to die, but he was cool, and he was also a numbers banker. And so I grew up with number sheets and all around my aunt and uncle's house. But Leslie got out of the war, and he got into I don't know what the cause of it was. He got into a hassle down on Tremont Street. In fact, I really think it's the same pool room where Malcolm met Shorty Jarvis. And so he came home and got his pistol and went back and whacked one or more of the people. But because my uncle was in touch with the Irish mafia, he got Leslie the best criminal defense attorney. So Leslie only got a year and a day eventually. So he was in Charlestown at the same time as Malcolm. Mm-hmm. So when I met Malcolm later, when Malcolm came to speak at Harvard, I went up after his talk, mentioned Roxbury and Leslie, and then we were tight until he died. Mm-hmm.
Let me ask a little bit more about your personal history in those years. Obviously, it was something of a quite unusual thing still for an African American young man to be up through Boston and into Harvard. I'm interested kind of in your recollections of that, moving through those experiences.
Well, there may or may not have been a quota, but there were only 11 of us out of 1,000 guys at Harvard. And because of that number, you knew all the black guys who'd gone to Harvard 10 years before you, or 20 years before you, and 20 years after you. So it was an informal, and then they would, there was a little socialization process when you arrived. They would say, well, most of the people whom you will encounter here will believe that you're only here for one of two reasons, that you were some maid's son or that you were a genius, and your responsibility is to demonstrate point B. So there was a nurturing group presence in Cambridge for us. And I remember Harvard, I have very fond memories of Harvard. Harvard taught, like Du Bois, Du Bois started writing for newspapers when he was in a high school student in Great Barrington, and when he got to Harvard, he flunked I think it was English 1. It was introductory, because they used to have a compulsory freshman writing class for everyone. And I had been similarly favored. I skipped kindergarten, and they wanted me to skip first grade, and then I'd done well at Latin school. So when I got into the writing class, I was a little florid with my language. And we had an English teacher, even Mr. Russo, who said to us, "And now, young men, I am going to teach you the secret of good writing. The secret of good writing is rewriting." And so I was able to carry that on, on to Harvard. But I have very pleasant memories of Cambridge, actually. Yeah. Except when they asked me to leave them all my money in my will. Little money that I have here.
I had meant to ask earlier. I just want to make sure I bet it's here. Yeah, your birth date is the 4th of January, 1937. So you finished at Boston Latin in
54.
54. Oh, so basically with Brown. Coincidentally with Brown.
Yeah, I wasn't thinking about Brown at the time. No.
Yeah.
Actually, that's not quite true, because let me think about that, because I was involved with the NAACP Youth Council when I was in high school, and they had a slogan, free by 63, the centennial of the Emancipation Proclamation. So I had forgotten that I was involved with the NAACP Youth Council. Yeah.
Well, on that point, you've kind of anticipated what was going to be my next question, which is, did you come from a race family, and were you an adolescent with much of that question in your mind?
No, not particularly. It's, there were, episodes. I didn't think about them at the time. The significance of them crystallized later. Going to visit as I said, my Uncle Gray, who was another role model of mine, he had to leave Georgia because he had a girlfriend who I also remember as being quite striking, and some white guy was pursuing her, and I don't know whether he killed him, but they had a confrontation. He at least beat the hell out of him. And then he had to leave. He went to Detroit to live with his older brother, my uncle, in Detroit. But later on, when I got to Harvard, as I mentioned in the Malcolm article, and was in this it let me into this graduate seminar with C. Eric Lincoln and Whitney Young, and I started going to, as I said in the article, race was all around me. And I started and run into Malcolm again. And I started going to what was then Temple Number 11, which Farrakhan, who was then known as Louis X. And listening, as I also say in my notes to you, that I was very attracted to Malcolm's worldview. But and so I started thinking about going to Georgia, and you come out of the train station, and etched in stone in the building is colored and white. And also I had been in the Corps as well, and I remember, and this is. You said you interviewed the charades. I remember being called they asked for my next duty station, and they asked me how would I like to go to Albany. And the only Albany I knew was Albany, New York. So I said, I thought to myself, that's super. I can swoop down to Harlem, et cetera, at Kettering, and then I went down to Howard because there was one of our rival fraternities, the Kappas, had a big social event called the Kappa Dawn Dance. So, and I'd almost gone to Howard because I'd been offered a super scholarship, and they had brought me down to Howard, and I walked across campus and saw a million girls who looked like Halle Berry. And I had a neighborhood friend, Carl McCall, who was treasurer, lieutenant governor of New York at some point, and he had gone to Dartmouth, and he was there with a guy whose name will come to me perhaps, who was a little older, whose mother was the principal of the famous, I think she was or he had gone as an undergraduate to Dunbar High School, the famous black school in Washington, and this guy was a basketball player, and he had left Dartmouth, gone to Howard, and then returned to Dartmouth. So I was talking to my mother and friends about going to Howard and then going up to Cambridge, and they said in effect, "Schmuck, take your behind to Cambridge." So because back in those days, there was a community, so it wasn't just you and your family. Your church knew, about your exploits and your accomplishments. So you had, in essence, the responsibility of the race, because we were told that we had to be twice as good as white people, as white competitors. So you had that responsibility. But I must say that if you grow up if you remember the famous movie 10, or if you grew up in a community where you believe that the women you encounter are all 8, 9s, and 10s, then you go to Howard and see that they're really only 4s and 5s. Socially, you said, whoop, have mercy, Jesus. So what they said, no, you go on to Harvard, and Howard can wait, and so it did wait. But then, to finish the other story, it's just that when I looked at while I was at Howard and looked at my orders, I saw that it wasn't Albany, New York, but Albany, Georgia, or as the natives pronounce it, Albany. And that was the Marine Corps was a very important formative experience, because most of the military, I assume, still is fundamentally a Southern institution. And the people that you had in the Corps were, especially the officers et al., were Southerners, and the enlisted men were Southerners and or young guys whom the judge had told, well, you have two choices, the Joint or the Marine Corps. So, but I learned about dimensions of white America that I never would have learned otherwise had I not been in the Corps.
When were you in the Marine Corps?
56, 59.
56. What were some of those? What would be examples of some of those things that you learned?
Well, the Marine Corps has a culture, and that they instill in you I don't know what they're doing now, because now all the uniforms look alike, and the whole period of training is not the same as it used to be. But if you make a distinction between who you are or were as a civilian and then as a jarhead, there are things that you do when you're a civilian that are civilized. If it's raining or snowing, you go inside. And what they teach you is when you think that you cannot take another step, you can run 5 more miles. So you become acquainted with reserves personal reserves that you would never otherwise have known. And that creates a certain image, identity, which also can work against you because people didn't think they're invulnerable. But it does. I mean, you develop a kind of superiority attitude towards civilians and to the Army and the Navy, the Swabbies, because the Army shoots from the 300-yard line, we shoot from the 500-yard line. So they instilled, for some of these guys, the Corps was their mother and their daddy. I mean, I don't know, and I knew some of their personal stories, but for some of these guys, the Marine Corps was everything for them. And trying to understand where those needs came from was educational for me. And then also you become more humble, because I remember being in boot camp and in Paris Island, and then at Camp, and then later on in Lejeune, that I'm walking across the base and find myself humming the Everly Brothers. That you get indoctrinated in an atmosphere, because I had been going to Storyville and the Stables and was deep into jazz and R&B. But when you're enveloped in an environment, it's interesting how it can creep into your consciousness. I'm walking around the base humming "Bye Bye 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 Love," and I'm still in touch. One of my old buddies, although we weren't in the same outfit, just came up to visit me from. Well, there was a big event in D.C. for the Buffalo Soldiers. He's living in Savannah, where they just murdered outside with Jackson, where they just murdered Troy Anthony Davis, and he rode his bike up. He was also he came up. He wants to sell his house in Boston. Then he rode up here to Amherst to visit me. So there is a fraternity that stays with you forever, actually.
Sure.
Yeah. So coming out of the Marine Corps, you went into.
I went back to Harvard. Yeah.
Yeah. And you already enrolled there briefly?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm interested too, moving through the last half of the 50s, things like huge things like Brown and Montgomery and Emmett Till and Little Rock and all. I'm just wondering about how you're watching those things unfold and thinking about them at the time, as best you can conjure and recall.
I wasn't thinking much about them. The thing that I think struck the consciousness of everyone, and subsequently was the reason I later discovered why many people of my generation joined SNCC, was the murder of Emmett Till, because Jet had his picture displayed. And then at Harvard, I took an English course with a very famous professor of literature at the time, Howard Mumford Jones, and he had us reading Richard Wright, Uncle Tom's Children. Uncle Tom's Children will blow your mind. And people still, I talk to my friends, colleagues in literature about the significance of that book, because to me, I mean, I teach it when I teach civil rights on my Malcolm and Martin course, I start the students off with Uncle Tom's Children. I want them to understand just how capricious racism, Southern racism was, and how the least little thing could suddenly become a matter of life and death. So I read Uncle Tom's Children, and that helped. And then Jimmy Baldwin, in Notes of a Native Son, he has an essay in which, in essence, he says, has there ever been a Negro who at some point is not consumed with rage and wants to? And I said, oh, I'm not the only one. So, and then I was at Harvard, and then that's when I joined NSM. NSM was, as I mentioned, was started by a young white undergraduate at Yale, Peter Countryman, and it had city projects all around the country in Chicago and Detroit, and Boston, Hartford, New York. And they was somehow connected to NAG, because that's how I first met Stokely. I've left out Chicago, Detroit, Hartford, and Hartford as well. And then when Peter decided to go back to school, they asked me to become executive director, and I agreed to do that. So that took me, going to visit the city projects around the country. Created opportunities. I could meet people like James and Grace Boggs.
Yeah, I have a range of questions about all that, but can I just wind back just a bit and ask you one more thing? I'm just interested. Is there anything more to say about your mother and her influence?
Her influence was incalculable. I mean, she, in effect, devoted her life to me. And that's another reason I tried to do well, to honor her commitment. You're gonna make me cry.
Happens lots in these interviews.
Yeah. Yeah. But she was a great, great person. Yeah. I had great relatives. My aunts, uncles, I had great relatives. And that's what you see missing with this generation. There's no community. I mean, you kind of belong to the community. And where I lived on Walnut Avenue, it was still, Jewish, Irish, Armenians, and I went to the Henry Lee Higginson School. It was from the Higginson that I went to Latin school. So you had all of these different nationalities in your classroom, but the black community in your neighborhood, mostly you went to the same church, but you belonged to everybody. And you recognized, but for example, a few years ago, Grace Boggs was telling me about Detroit, and she was saying, Billy, we can't go out and organize the way we used to, because you get these gangbangers, and you're taking your life in your hands just walking out in the street. So the changes, I mean, truthfully, the race is in limbo as has never been before. And there's a confusion. The younger generation is ahistorical. It's not their fault, but you don't have what we had. They don't. Yeah, I mean, we don't have black newspapers. We don't have black radio stations. 5 corporations control the media. So that there is a difference. I don't blame the young people, because you didn't, in our previous history, you didn't have to teach people what it meant to be black. There was continuity, but now we are, because most of our history, we have been a Southern people. But now we are 2 and 3 generations removed from the South. And now you have all this confusion about gender or identity and sexual orientation identity, where black women identify as female, gender before they do, and gays who identify as gay before black. And now you have the census with all these different definitions. Are you Hispanic, white, Hispanic? And now we have new, quote, black people here. You have black people from Africa and from the West Indies who don't have America's history behind them. So, you know, I remember, you know, being in Harlem, being passed by black cab drivers. Well, phenotypically black. Or getting off the, flying to DC, and you have African or Indian Bengals that may or may not pick you up because they want to take white people to Virginia, to the suburbs. So there's a great confusion about race in America today, which of course the evil people take advantage of. Divide. What they used to divide you by color, now they divide you by gender and whatever.
Which was the church in Roxbury? Your church?
My church, Charles Street, AME.
Charles Street, AME.
Mm-hmm. Reverend Walter Cornelius Davis.
Did you move into your early adulthood still feeling a close tie to the church? Either spiritual or social, or?
Not particularly, except in the service, you become religious when you're being shot at. No, I've never been. I mean, I enjoyed the church experience, but I approached it. Actually, I mean, a good black preacher will just, you know, when he starts rapping, or she, because now I've heard some very good female preachers, it's a whole different milieu. It's a whole different, you know, experience. A good preacher will, you know, I will respond independent of whether I believe in the theology, but I'll certainly respond to a good preacher. Mm-hmm.
Tell me about, you mentioned too that one of the things that you felt in those years, I'm thinking now late 60s, you're moving back into Harvard, and that you felt, and quite understandably felt, a great deal of rage. And was NSM your principal sort of institutional mechanism for acting on that, or?
Yeah, I think I did keep in touch with the NAACP, but I was in Cambridge, so going back to Boston wasn't like being in Boston in high school. I think NSM, because you saw the situation of black people all in different regions of the country, and so that was educational. And while I was, our office was adjacent to Harlem, not quite in Harlem.
Oh, this is when you moved down in 63.
Yeah. And I worked with another great guy whose story needs to be told, Jesse Gray, the Harlem Rent Strike leader. And that was another question. He said, and that introduced me to the whole question of the history of black communists. You know, how they when they insisted that race trumped class, how that was a non-starter for the party. And Jesse had been with another, Josh, had been in the Merchant Marines. So I got that history of struggle from, you know, black leftists. And then Jesse taught me something about organizing, because he had an office like in East Harlem, like East 114th, East 115th. And then when people got fed up with being exploited by the landlords, he had a was known, even written up in the papers, they would call the office, and then we would go over to their apartments, and he would give them, tell them what they had to do. That you had to keep collecting the rent money and put it in the bank or somewhere, so that when the strike was over, when they came to kick you out, you could have paid the back rent. But it was a very important lesson about how to organize. That the secret of organizing is convincing people to organize themselves, although they may not realize that it's what's happening at the time. They're ready, and then you give them what needs to be done, so that they organize themselves. So that was a very important lesson. And Jesse was a great spirit.
How old was he at that time, approximately?
Oh, God. I guess he must. Well, everybody seemed old back when you. I guess he was probably, because he died young. I guess he was somewhere between 40 and 50.
And you were mid-20s, 26, 27.
Yeah.
Would he have
Let
been...
me see. If he was Merchant Marines, and then World War II, and then 68. He was 25. Yeah, he was probably mid-40s. Probably mid-40s, yeah.
Well, I wanted to ask, and this is maybe the connection, I wanted to ask, one of the very interesting things about NSM, as you've noted in things you've written, is that after some early efforts, say, on tutoring black youths in communities, there was a more of a structural shift in the thinking and the critique, and community organizing became a big focus, obviously. And in the tenure, your tenure as executive director, and predates, I think it's important to note, SNCC's later community work in some ways. Is that your sense?
No.
Oh, no.
Because SNCC influenced us.
Okay.
It would be difficult to draw the line of demarcation. People may have been doing community organizing even under Peter, but it became after everybody began to understand the problem was much greater than tutoring kids. SNCC was a major influence on our thinking, and then we had in Detroit we had the union folk, and you had the guys from Detroit who were organizing, and although they weren't in NSM per se, we were in touch with them, and so they were a role model. And there was a great guy whose history needs to be told, named Kenny Cockrell, and Kenny was one of the organizers with a guy named General Baker of the black youth in Detroit, and he became a lawyer, and he was the only person I have met who almost could rap like Malcolm. He was a fantastic rapper. He became a lawyer, and he had a few wonderful cases. He had a case with this black policewoman who got into some altercation with a white officer in the police station garage, and he got her off. And then there was another case of a black worker on the line who also had he may even have killed the co-worker, and Kenny got him off as well. And then he ran for office. He was elected to the Detroit City Council, and decided that was duplicitous to try and convince people that city council could make the changes that were necessary. So he resigned from the city council, and then unfortunately he had a heart attack, and he died in his early 50s. But he was as we used to say, he was a bad motorcycle.
After you make the shift to New York in '63 and across '64, you're obviously, as you mentioned, traveling to see NSM work in the cities where it's involved, and you'll go to Mississippi as well in '64. But I want to ask about how this relocation to New York brought you back into contact with Malcolm, and how the arguments you were hearing him present, how you took them up and considered them in relationship to what you were observing through NSM, through SNCC, through.
Well, as I mentioned in that critique, I'm in high school and we're watching Martin, and Martin is saying things like, "If any blood is to be spilled, let it be ours." And we're saying, "Oh no!" But we said something a lot stronger than that, actually. But
that was not an argument that persuaded you.
No, we were not. We were not persuaded by that. But when I got into New York, as I also say in the article, Malcolm was everywhere. He was always having these rallies on 125th Street. So was Michaud. There were these guys, Eddie Porkchop Davis. They brought their ladders or whatever, and they would be rapping in front of the Hotel Teresa, and Malcolm would be walking, and then I would go down to the restaurant. I don't know. And as I said, also I had brought him after we had reconnected at Harvard. I brought him up to Harvard a couple of times. So as I also mentioned, I don't know why. I assume because he knew Leslie, but he even visited me at my house before I left Boston. But he never tried to convert me. He never tried to convert me, because I wasn't about to give up spare ribs and chasing young girls. So I couldn't join the nation. Oh no.
Tell me about how you began to think your way through the political critique that Malcolm was advancing.
Well, people don't appreciate, as I also wrote there, Malcolm, as I wrote in the piece, in the same way that Marx is the fundamental critic of capitalism and Fanon is the fundamental critic of colonialism, to my mind, Malcolm is the fundamental critic of American racism. And he would be critiquing. And what people also don't appreciate is Malcolm was as hard on black people as he was on white people. He would talk about, you don't want to, you talk about you're outnumbered. If the man sends you to Korea to fight 900 million Chinese, you don't say you're outnumbered. You don't say you're outnumbered there. He got you thinking about how you'd been brainwashed. And then he would say, when he was critiquing Martin, he would talk about the sit-ins, and he would say, "Well, who sits? Cripples sit. Old lady," he didn't say cripples, that's but disabled people sit. The old women sit. Babies sit. We don't need to sit. We need to stand up. So he had a way, as I also said in a Village Voice piece. If you want to know what was going on in world events or national events, all you did was walk on down to 125th Street and tune in on the X, because he was a prodigious reader. I think I may or may not have mentioned it in Make It Plain, but I caught him once reading William Buckley's Saturday Review, and I asked National Review. Yeah, that's right. Saturday Review was Andrea Cousins, Norman Cousins, and Andrea Cousins worked for NSM. In fact, she works right down. She's a lay therapist down in Northampton. But I asked him why was he reading National Review, and he said, because you never can tell where you come across a good idea. And he had a prodigious work habits and read several papers a day, magazines, always reading. And to answer your question, I agreed with his critique of the movement, and the duplicity of the government. We have him in Eyes on the Prize, because the first rebellion in this country is in Birmingham in May of '63, when there's an attempt to whack Martin. They they bombed the A.G. Gaston Motel where he was staying. They also bombed A.D. King, his brother's house. And it was then that the black masses of Birmingham erupted. And Malcolm makes this point that when Bull Connor was using fire hoses and whatever, Kennedy said he couldn't intervene. But as soon as the black people erupted, they nationalized the Guard. And Malcolm, we have this famous scene, well, it's famous to me, in the Eyes episode, The Time Has Come, where Malcolm says, and there was no new law. See? And then that's the Snicket. You have the March on Washington, but Medgar Evers had just been assassinated, and SNCC workers in Georgia had been arrested.
Capital charge, sedition.
Mm-hmm. For picketing outside the business, if I recall, of a juror. You know. And they invoked some 19th century law to arrest the Snickers. And the FBI just stands around and takes notes but does nothing. And then in '64, after Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman are killed, Hoover says that they're not, that they can't protect civil rights workers. They could COINTELPRO us, but they couldn't protect us. And that's where Worth's statement comes from, a little later down the road. I mean, black power doesn't drop from the sky. I mean, Stokely was jailed a zillion damn times. People get tired, as Mrs. Hamer says, people get tired of being sick and tired and relying on a government that does nothing for you and collaborates with the southern racists whom you are confronting. Yeah.
We're back on. Let me ask you, Bill, to talk a little bit. Let's spend a little bit of time talking. You teach it obviously and have taught it in depth and thought so much about this. Let's talk a little bit more about Malcolm's critique of racism, its role and function in the society.
Well, one of the things Malcolm used to say is that history was the most rewarding of all subjects to study. And I remember being in the mosque, and he was quoting from a book called Anti-Slavery by Dwight Lowell Dumont, which is, of course, now out of print. And Malcolm was talking about the slave power. See, the history is all about how do you contextualize it? What would you think? Well, suppose you were E.T. coming down from space, and you're trying to understand. You read about the glories of America, and then someone was asking about the greatest presidents, and invariably in that lineup is Abraham Lincoln. So then E.T. asks you, well, what president was he? And you say, if you've done your homework, he was the 16th president. Now, what is your image of America if you are taught that of the 15 presidents before Abe, 10 were slave owners? How does that square with the image of democracy? Or again, in relationship to the government's treaties with the Indians. And once, well, we understand that they broke the treaties. But how many treaties did they break? They broke all 400. So where is the morality in which the society garbs itself? Where is it? And that's what Malcolm would do. Malcolm would just throw the history at you and make you rethink what you had been taught. On one level, I mean, all societies like to think well of themselves. That's not unusual. That's not unusual in itself. In fact, it's de rigueur. But America is very pompous about it, and we've just seen it with Troy Anthony Davis. The whole world, embassies all around the world, there were protests. And I asked my students to try to get them to understand how they're being brainwashed. I said, did you watch the Arab Spring? And they said, you watch what's happening in Tunisia? Yes. You watch what's happening in Egypt? Yes. So let me ask you something. Now that we've established the fact that the American media can bring you on-site coverage from the Middle East, when's the last time you saw on-site coverage from Iraq or Afghanistan? And the answer is, or from the West Bank or Gaza or Tel Aviv. The answer is never, never. So you're being, and I asked them also if they have a language to read foreign newspapers, just to see what stories are covered and how they're covered abroad, and what stories are covered or not covered, and how they're covered here in America. Because Americans are the most deceived, except for the people who want to be deceived. But it's easier to maintain control over people if you take away their critical thinking. And unfortunately, that seems to be, mental retardation seems to be sweeping the country. And I just wrote a quick piece. My friends were calling me about, after they had been following these Republican debates, and they called and said, well, what is happening in America? How can these people be potential presidents of your country? The outside world doesn't understand what's going on, but America has lost its credibility in the world. Well, it had lost it before under Bush. There was no place in the world Bush could go where there were not protests against him, also not covered by the media. When he went during his first term, when he went to London, he couldn't ride he had to take a helicopter to Windsor Palace. And the Lord Mayor, there were 15,000 security, and it cost every citizen of London £2 to pay for his security. And the Lord Mayor said that Bush was the most unwelcome visitor since William of Orange, and they would have preferred to give £5 and have him not come than spend £2 for his security when he did come. But none of this is unpleasantness is shared with the American people. So we live in a media cocoon, which is proving increasingly disastrous.
I'm sure we'll come back to the media question when we talk about the effort to develop Black Studies curriculum. But let me ask you, holding that point for now, let me ask you about your experience trying to help with an effort fundamentally to restructure the politics of Mississippi, and through that effort, national politics of race around the MFDP, because you would go down to Mississippi in '64.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is, the government was trying to derail the student protests, and there were two opinions. A lot of people were committed to sit-ins and protests. But the government talked about the power of the vote, and so Bob goes down to Mississippi, and they had organized the freedom because the Mississippi politicians had claimed black people were happy and content and weren't interested in voting. So they organized the freedom vote in '63, and 63,000 people voted. And that was also to acquaint them, as later Stokely and did in Lowndes County, to acquaint them with the procedures. And out of those procedures, they decided to form a political party and to challenge 3 of the white congressmen. So they nominated Mrs. Hamer and Mrs. Victoria Gray and Mrs. Annie Devine. And the lawyers went and gathered evidence as to the extensive nature of voter suppression in Mississippi. And then that was a little contretemps for the movement, because SNCC was working and the MFDP were working with the National Lawyers Guild, and they were too leftist for, of course they got red-baited, too leftist for Allard Lowenstein and the NAACP, but I worked all the time with Bill Kunstler and Arthur Kenoy. So when I came back to help organize the congressional support for the challenge. And the guy who was really most instrumental, who has also not gotten the recognition that he deserved, was William Fitzryan from New York. When the Congress reconvened in January, it is he who put forward the resolution, because Congress makes its own laws, and therefore the 3 white congressmen had to step aside while the resolution was being debated. When he raised it, then 50 or 60 other congressmen rose up to support him, and then when the vote was eventually taken, the MFDP got, if I remember correctly, 149 votes, which was not enough because you had to have a majority of the 435. But at least temporarily, we had demonstrated just how crooked the system is.
Coming out of Atlantic City and then the failed January challenge, did that at that point, would those experiences have altered and reshaped your basic perspective, or just confirmed it?
I'm trying to remember. I wasn't in Atlantic City. I was somewhere else for some. Was that back in Mississippi? I wasn't in Atlantic City. No, because they had come up in the buses. You better turn this off. I think I was chasing.
Yeah. We're rolling.
Bill, we were back after a short break just to get a drink for a moment. I was going to ask your perspective on that question just before we stopped. Did the MFDP experiences alter, adjust, or largely confirm your perspective at the time?
You know, I was thinking about that. My strongest the strongest impact the MFDP did for me was not quite about politics per se. It was sitting in Mrs. Hamer's room and understanding that with all of my education, that there were people like Mrs. Hamer who could see the world with a clarity that was infinitely superior to mine. Right? That they had a wholesomeness. She's gonna make me cry again. That, you know, if you weren't in touch with it, that you just didn't realize that it existed. And it's different. Like Malcolm was somebody that you could. There are 2 people that I would have followed anywhere. Malcolm was one. The other was my second mother, Catherine Dunham. But it humbled you to realize that all of this book learning and whatever was secondary to a particular kind of acuity about what makes the world go round and what is important in the world, what's important in life. So I think that's the strongest impact. Getting to know, people. I mean, Bob was in Mississippi before I got there, and with Amzie Moore, and they tell me that he was taking people down to register, and he got beaten up, severely, and went back and took off his T-shirt and washed it, and then put it back on and went back down to the courthouse. But he said he was washing the shirt because he didn't want the blood to scare the people. I mean, there is a heroism that defies description. So those are the things that, because Mississippi, we used to just call Mississippi the state when you're going in. And then that's actually one of the reasons that I went ahead and got married, because if I wanted something out of life in case I got killed, I wanted to partake of life. I mean, she was a cool woman though. She was super cool, but I had been a bachelor for a long time, but I just was trying. It was kind of like preparing your will.
What year did you marry?
60. I think it was 65. Yeah.
Somebody new from the Mississippi contest?
No.
But you'd come out of that by then?
No.
I mean, you'd had that experience by then?
Yeah. And I went back for after January. I went back to the state for a while.
I'm sorry, you went back after the...
After January, I went back for a while. No, I married this very attractive young woman whom I met in New York. Turn it off.
Okay. We're back.
We're back. February 21, 1965.
We were in NSM was having a meeting in upstate New York, and all of our project directors and people were there when we heard that Malcolm had been killed. First it was unbelievable. Then you get pissed out of your mind. But he was every once in a while history will produce someone. And this Village Voice piece I wrote on the 20th anniversary of Malcolm's assassination, I was saying Martin kind of embodied the personality of the South, but Malcolm embodied the personality of the urban North black person. So they didn't just kill a man, they killed the prototype. So we came on back to the city, to find out what had happened and whatever. And then that day, later for the funeral, I was just thinking, now suppose Roy Wilkins had died, but these zillions of people, be trying to go to his funeral. I didn't have anything against Roy Wilkins, it was just a different kind of image. So that was an irreplaceable loss.
What were your choices in front of you at that point with NSM and graduate school and all, and how did you move forward from early '65?
I was just thinking about that. I got married, went back to school, Um, I was still riding back and forth to New York. I had a job at Columbia for a while with Gizmo's father.
I'm sorry?
I'm trying to think of it. Oh, we did. That's why Vincent called me again, and I went down because we put together this TV program called Black Heritage, which is on CBS, and many of the people whom he had, Vincent and John Henrik Clark. In essence, it was, the first representation of black studies, certainly on television. But CBS would put it on, 5 o'clock in the morning. TV in those days would go off at 1 or whatever. And then it would come back with, I forgot what they used to call it, to come back on at 5 or 6. And then the very first thing on would be Black Heritage. And then years later, some students were trying to track it down, and I don't remember whether it was CBS or whether it was later HBO, because HBO did the trial of James Earl Ray and then denied that they had done it. So we did, and as I said, most of the people, the Boggses and Larone, the people who were involved in that Black Heritage series, Vincent invited to Atlanta after Martin was assassinated, and Coretta asked him to become director of the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Center.
Yeah. When did, I think I had a mistaken sense of when Black Heritage aired. It began airing approximately?
Somewhere between, I think 65 or 66, maybe 67.
Okay, I was thinking 67, 68.
Yeah, somewhere. It might even have been 68.
Okay.
Somewhere in that, I think, in that 3-year
Yeah.
period.
Yeah. Well, are there, I'm sure there are many, but are there especially interesting things that you would want to say about the shift of context now back to graduate school and finding your academic life now engaging these same questions, but from that angle?
Well, I had discovered another hero to study, Frantz Fanon. So I was, and La Guerre d'Algérie, the Algerian War. So plunging myself into the FLN, and appreciating Fanon. So
you discovered another hero. Was Fanon someone you met? I mean, came across?
No, well, Fanon emerged in the movement because many people who were opposed to Martin's nonviolence would quote Fanon because Fanon talked about burying colonialism in the bowels of the earth, and so many people who never read Les Damnés de la Terre had never read Wretched of the Earth and didn't know squat about the Algerian War, but they would just take an excerpt from Fanon and use it to contravene Martin's notion of nonviolence. So then I decided to read the book, and then from there I decided, I went on to try and understand the whole, because then every other thing, a lot of kinds of other things open up. The contribution of French Africans in World War II. In the liberation of Paris, the Allies insisted that the black troops not march. They went and got anybody who didn't look black, Egyptians, whatever, other Europeans, to march, down the Champs-Élysées and the Arc de Triomphe. I mean, the racism was incredible. So that just opened up a whole different, broadened my perspective about what Malcolm was talking about how rewarding a subject of study history is, but you begin to put things together. Because history is, I tell my students, history is just, it's not about dates. You understand the significance of dates and events when you understand the continuity, how things are connected. Then you will remember. It's not but just to remember dates abstractly doesn't mean anything to you. What is the flow of history? How do we get from A to B to C to D? And once you begin to understand the flow, then things become remarkably clearer. And even you may even remember them.
How'd the graduate faculty at Harvard respond to the work you were doing as a graduate student?
Well, I was studied with Erik Erikson, and initially I was going to be a shrink because I loved Freud, and they had told me what was this class I was taking with Boring, Edward Boring. He was a psychologist, interesting guy, but we went to a mental hospital in Waltham, and there was a black guy there. And at the time we were studying this English guy, non-directive therapy. So when you're involved with a relationship, in that dyadic relationship, the two of you, you're never supposed to impose yourself. And so, the typical technique is when they say something, you simply repeat it. So he asked me, "Are you one too?" And I said, "Am I one?" And it turned out he was a World War I vet, and racism had driven him crazy. And then the field changed. The field went from psychoanalysis to drug therapy. And then when I discovered Fanon, I said, well, that's the psychology I'm interested in. That's that liberation cycle. Yeah, liberation therapy. That's what I'm interested in, right? So I made the switch from Freud to Fanon. In fact, years ago, I brought Madame Fanon here to speak before she died. Actually, she's alleged to have committed suicide, which I don't understand. Josie Fanon. Have you ever been to Algiers?
No.
Paris? J'aime Paris.
Let's talk about the emergence after, actually maybe stop and ask you about the events of spring of '68 and how they would in their course in a year or so lead to the notion of the IBW. And maybe it should be a good point too to talk about kind of your long view of Dr. King.
Well, as I said, my initial view of Martin, I met Martin a couple of times in the course of the movement, but he didn't make any particular. And of course, I'd been in Selma, and when he turned us around,
You were there.
Yeah, I was in Selma for the third march, because there were three.
Yeah.
And in fact, SCLC, the original march was supposed to be to carry Jimmy Lee Jackson's body to Montgomery, but SCLC toned it down and made it a voting rights march. And so they called for us, and I came down with NSM people. In fact, you will not be able to recognize it, but we were captured in the Eyes episode, Bridge to Selma. You see our bus pulling into Selma, and NSM people and I are getting off the bus. But then after he turned us around, and we found out that that a deal had been made, it did not enhance my view of Martin. It's only later in Atlanta with Vincent listening, because Vincent was in Albany with Martin, and he lived across, and Vincent also lived across the street from Gladys. No, Gladys Knight went to the church across the street from Vincent's house, and Bernice Reagan lived on the first floor of Vincent's house. But when Vincent started, when we started researching, because our initial project was to try and understand the movement that had just ended. When he started talking about Martin and his relationship to Martin, the things Martin had done and the things that Martin had been subjected to. And then later, when I started teaching on Martin and Malcolm and read Garrow's Bearing the Cross, I gained a greater admiration for Martin, because Martin was converging toward Malcolm. There's a quote that I use in Make It Plain that he makes 6 months before his assassination, where he says that everything he has been doing so far has been in vain. The whole thing has to be done away with.
And by the whole thing, he means the whole structure of the American political economy.
Dabba 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 do. So Martin, and that's just, it's the same disillusionment that leads to Black Power. It's the same disillusionment that most of the movement people, went through. I mean, when Malcolm is attacked for being a hater and preaching violence, as I said, he was as hard on Black people as he was on white people. But the critical question is not whether or not Malcolm was a hater. The critical question is, why did tens of thousands and thousands more of Black men and women be sympathetic to Elijah Muhammad's description of the white man as the devil? That's the question. But America can't face itself. It can't face evil in its history. Everything it does is supposedly, So it talks about, again, to go back to the Lincoln example. Oh yes, there was slavery here. It was a little blip. It's a little blip, unfortunate blip in our history. But in 1860, America was the greatest slaveholding country in the history of the world. So when you start recontextualizing things, you draw much different conclusions. So I began to, after his death, and principally through Vincent, through the research we did at IBW, and subsequent research from my Malcolm and Martin course, I began to gain much more respect for Martin. I mean, if you just look, one of the things that he and Malcolm had in common, they were always on the road. And Martin had this whole responsibility to raise money for SCLC. And then the jealousy that he had to contend with. So I began to appreciate him much more as a very, very significant, distinguished, important person.
Tell me about Vincent Harding.
Vincent. I met Vincent we were at, I think, Miami of Ohio for some kind of mini conference where we were on a panel together when we first met. And then we stayed in touch, and then when Black Heritage came up, he and John Clark asked me to participate in that.
I'm sorry, who asked you?
John Henrik Clark
Yeah.
and Vincent. So I participated in that, and then when he told me about the IBW and asked me to come join him in Atlanta, I said yes, because the formal movement had died And there were all of these, you had all of these different things were going on, these different ideologies. You had Pan-Africanism. Baraka was leading Pan-Africanism before he switched to Marxism. And everybody was changing their name, which I thought was ridiculous. In fact, there's a very interesting debate between me and Stokely on this whole question of his All African People's Revolutionary Party. I said, Tricky, this is our struggle here, and go organize your mama. You have to mobilize people and to inspire them. You must talk to them, as Mao Zedong said. You must talk to the people, and as I'm paraphrasing, in the language they understand. So IBW there was a concert in Howard to which Walter Rodney came. And and Bobby Hill, who is the Garvey Scholar at UCLA, Bobby and Walter, they had been at Mona together, University of the West Indies, and then they'd been together in '68 at a Black Writers Conference, I think, in Toronto, and then the Jamaican government, the JLP, did not allow Walter to return. So Walter was went to Tanzania, was teaching at the University of Dar es Salaam. It's probably something before that, because he may have been in Guyana at some point. Because anyway, he came up, 71 or 72. He came back because he had gotten a job to teach in Guyana, but they wouldn't. Forbes Brennan wouldn't let him. So Emmanuel Wallerstein and James Turner and this was later then. We would get speaking engagements for him to help him raise money. But Walter came before that, Walter had come to the Summer Research Symposium that we conducted at Atlanta, and we became great friends. So I went to Africa in 71 or 72 to visit him in Dar. And that was also another eye-opening experience, because you had, Nyerere was being, like Nkrumah had been previously, was being idolized in the black world. And just like there had been these American black expats who had gone to Ghana, you had these black expats living in Tanzania. And I just found them very funny, actually, because they were living in this country, but they hadn't learned the language. And then when I got off the plane and ran into them, and I just thought it was very revealing, the questions they asked me. How were the Green Bay Packers doing? At Kettering, which was another important lesson that I learned, which was reinforced after I went to Cuba. You may rail against this country. You may call it all kinds of names, but you have no idea how it has crept into your mind. See? What are you used to? You go in, it's dark in a room, and you turn on the lights. Well, what happens when you're somewhere where there is no electricity? Or you're going to take a shower, and your shower and water being pumped from the sea, or there are no. Going to visit my grandparents in Georgia. I was used to outhouses, so that wasn't. But still, you gain more appreciation of the extent to which you may have disagreements with a particular society, but how it has affected you in ways that are beyond your kin, right? And that you then have to come to terms with. You then have to come to terms with the degree to which you have been socialized by the forces that you are railing against. So that was an important lesson for me in Dar.
Tell me about the mood and the project of IBW. It's an ambitious mission statement that emerges.
Mm-hmm. Well, it was the Black Studies thing, so we had a major conference and we brought in the people who were initiating Black Studies. As I should have mentioned in terms of MFDP, the person who was organizing out of Washington was Mike Thelwell, who was here, just retired from here. The wayward Jamaican. But initially, as I said, there was a little tension because the advisors of the King Center wanted it to simply be, Hallelujah Martin, and they almost wanted us to take an oath of nonviolence, and we said, no, later, baby, we ain't doing that. So then we split and became independent, and we had a newsletter, so we were commenting on current events. We had students that we were teaching, some of whom had been kicked out for protesting out of Morehouse and elsewhere, and then we had a relationship with Wesleyan, so we had students from Wesleyan who came down to our summer research, who came down to study with us. In fact, you're working with one, James Early. Early was one of my students whom I just have disowned subsequently. No, that's not true. We stay. He calls me Papa. And then, because we have a mutual tie to Cuba.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But then we just, we got, I'm sure the office was broken into several times. I'm sure we were co-intelproed.
Yeah.
And then of course the powers that be, after we separated from as I said in the piece, after we lost our Martin benediction, it was much more difficult to get foundation money. So we had to decide to try and be as independent as we could.
Yeah.
So then some of us who had degrees, Vincent left, went to his Quaker, because Vincent's a Mennonite. I guess that's one of the ties between him. Religion is a tie between him and Martin. So he went to Pendle Hill. Chester Davis, who had taught at Sir George Williams in Canada and who was our education person, he came here. And here, at the time, at UMass, Thelwell was here, whom I knew from SNCC, and Ivanhoe, whom I knew from SNCC. And there was a guy whom I didn't know, Sharif Gilal, who was with the FLN. And he used to teach the Fanon course. So Ivanhoe and Gilal, I hope I'm pronouncing his name, when they left, they asked me to come and take their places. And so that's what I did. And in those days, it was no big thing, because you could fly from New York to Atlanta for $90. So we all commuted back and forth for many years. And then Howard Dodson, who had been in had come in with Andrew Billingsley and from California, and George became police commissioner of Atlanta. But he had been a student of Billingsley's. Howard then became director of IBW, and then after Howard we had Jan Douglas and Pat Daly essentially who ran IBW. So IBW lasted till 1983.
Yeah. I've read that, and we talked about this before we started today, there's a new book about IBW by Derek White.
Mm-hmm.
and in a piece that he did last year that I haven't seen the book yet, but in the piece that he wrote a year ago, kind of on the IBW, Journal of African American History, or Studies, I think, he said that he described you in kind of the tally of the faculty and staff who emerged at the early IBW, that you were a disciple of Malcolm and a black and a political nationalist in that context. And I wonder if that is the way that you would have made the description, and whatever your answer to that is, how you would have described your kind of political philosophy and perspective.
Well, I've never thought about how to describe myself politically, actually. I think Manning Marable wrote a piece once in which he described James Turner and me as left nationalists.
Mm-hmm.
But if I were to pick one, I would say, if I'm anything, I'm a Malcolmite, and Malcolm is the fundamental guiding political influence of in my life. Yeah. I have to. As I said, I just got Derek's book. I have to see how he tells the story. Although I read his dissertation, and what I read seemed to me of the treatment so far, I think he's done the best job. Because it's hard to describe. I mean, IBW was the first and the only independent black think tank in this country's history.
Yeah.
And trying to, there's one of the most important elements of struggle is who defines. There's an African fable. They tell me that one day the little elephant comes home from school and asks his mother. He says, "Mother, in school the lions say they are the king of the jungle, and I thought we were the king of the jungle." And his mother tells him, "Well, they will always teach that in your school until we run the school." So there's a dialectic there. And the history, Negro history begins first trying to excavate, black people's contributions to the land, to try and advance the case, please treat us as equals. But then Black Studies comes along. When you begin to dig up the suppressed lacunae, you begin to get a whole different history of America. And then you begin to get, when people talk about Malcolm as a critique, you have to put, in my judgment, you have to put Malcolm with Jimmy Baldwin. Because the fire next time, Jimmy lays America down on the couch and analyzes it. And he analyzes the psychology of racism. The black people, it says, suppose you have a bucket, and when black people have the bucket, and then America stands on this bucket, and when you pull the bucket out from under their feet, they go topsy-turvy. So you must keep this hierarchy as fundamental to the maintenance of America's identity. So Jimmy must, in my judgment, along with Malcolm, is the two sharpest, critics of the contradictions of American society in their time period.
Did you? We've certainly touched on it and are right now, but I still feel in some way that we haven't quite done what we might, and I think it'd be very valuable in this series to have you say a little bit more about the full nature of the critique, as you were hinting, and not hinting, but describing it in summary form. Are there more things that you would like to say?
Well, what you understand, to go back to your earlier point, Vincent was a tremendous influence. Vincent does. He does. There is a river, that history up to through the Civil War there is, and given his, it's there is a river, the streams of which make glad the people of God. And then we thought we had a contract with a DC television station, WETA, all right, to do something like Black Heritage. And so we put together a history, because it was supposed to be, yes, it was supposed to be for the centennial, 1976, I think. But then the station got bought us anyway. Oh no, Roots came, and they said, well, one black thing is enough. So so Roots took our was the black historical television story for the year. So Vincent took what we had done and he published it as The Other American Revolution. And then later he's done a book. He's done Hope and History, how to teach the history of the movement, you know, to high school young people. And then he's done Martin, The Inconvenient Hero, because as I again tell the students, all they know about Martin is the March on Washington and I Have a Dream, but the next 5 years of Martin's life go down Orwell's memory hole. And that's what Vincent does. Vincent explains the whole history of Martin, and especially those last 5 years, Martin's development and his evolution. So Vincent was a tremendous influence on me, at least, and I think on everybody. He and Lerone helped me think about how to write better. And as I also said, he has the gift of communication. As I said earlier, you know, your mother could be dead, but by the time Vincent explained it to you, you'd be saying, "Oh, Ma's gone." The mellifluous one, I call it. He just turned 80. Yeah, but he's still out here. He and Grace Boggs, who's 95, going around the country trying to form alliances between seniors and young people, in addition to the oral history project at ILEF that he's been directing for the last decade and a half, probably.
We haven't done but bump against it, but I'd be really interested to have you reflect a little bit about COINTELPRO and the whole effort by the state to smash domestic dissent.
Well, we always said the man was everywhere. But you know, we thought FBI, CIA. We didn't know. After Malcolm, we found out the MI5 and the Surrett, and the Mossad, and everybody was tracking Malcolm. And Martin too, and the State Department, everybody. You know, Malcolm seemed to be too much of a danger to too many people. So you always assume. I mean, your experience was you'd seen the FBI doing nothing and/or virtually colluding with the forces of evil. So you had no and Hoover. You know, you had no respect for them. And then you have the other question. Not just COINTELPRO, you have the question of the behavior of the police. The police are the military arm of the racist state. And every rebellion, when we began talking about '63, every rebellion in this country, with the exception of May '63 in Birmingham, and the zillion that occurred, I think 200 after Martin's assassination, every rebellion, not a race riot, every rebellion was in response to some police act of racism, either actual or perceived. People thought they'd done something, and so they blow up.
Because of the context, obviously. History and context.
So and that's why this whole history of urban rebellions, because race riots, it has the connotation of two forces, and also mindlessness, rioting. There's no reason, there's no political reason, there's no justification for the people just rioting. But I happened to have been I was in Harlem in '64, and I was in Detroit in '67, and the rebellions in Detroit were quite purposeful. The Lebanese, who called themselves Chaldeans, were exploiting. They purposely, their stores were targeted, and not only were they targeted, requests were made. People would, do you want a TV? Do you want it? They would provide people put in their order. they would get whatever the merchandise was, and then after they had satisfied all of the community demands, then they would crack the store. But I also was the Newark Black Power Conference, which was held after Newark, where once again the residents were targeted particular stores. But then the National Guard came in and perceived what was going on, and so they smashed everything to convey this notion of mindlessness. And the same thing in Detroit. The media would report, why are they burning down their homes? People were not burning down their homes. It's because the wind, the fire department would not come down into the areas. The wind blew the damn flames over there. But this necessity, because if rebellion is legitimate, then America is illegitimate. And so therefore you must always define the behavior as illegitimate. So those are the kind of things that IBW, and looking at what was going on, and how America interprets events, that crystallize your concept of an analysis of the nation.
Yeah. Pause for just a second.
As they say,
We're back on after the break.
c'est un mot.
Bill, let me ask about the project that culminated, I think, '94 with the publication of Make It Plain, the book on Malcolm. And I'm interested in your reflections on that. Of course, was a companion to a documentary that was televised, and I'm interested in your perspective on interpreting Malcolm in that kind of context for what will be a national and popular audience in some ways.
Well, Make It Plain arises out of an Eyes on the Prize episode. The episode was called The Time Has Come. It was a half hour, was one, and then it goes on to Stokely and the Meredith March. But Black Side, Henry Hampton's organization, who must be given great, because he got this Eyes on the Prize funded during the Reagan era. That episode got more response than any other episode in the Eyes series. And so Black Side would then enter into a relationship with PBS to do Make It Plain. And they since I had been a consultant for the Eyes episode, they asked me to consult on in essence, to be immodest, they asked me to be chief consultant. And so I did. I agreed to do that. And then they wanted a companion book, and they asked a much more well-known writer than I and he presented a proposal, and I saw it and thought it was lacking. And so I critiqued it and suggested how the book, the introduction of the book should go. And they said, well, write it. And I said, okay. Because at the time, there was this great hullabaloo around Malcolm. The rap people, Public Enemy was talking. Every autobiography was in every bookstore. And I thought that people really didn't appreciate. I wanted to try and describe why, as objectively as I could, why I thought Malcolm was a great man. And that's how I tried to write Make It Plain.
Was that if I'll just pause for a second.
We're back after a short break. Let's take just a minute here, and since we've just talked about Make It Plain, and you obviously are right now are just publishing a piece in response to the new Manny Marable Malcolm X biography. And in brief, can you summarize the critique of Marable's book that you present there?
Well, essentially the critique is that the book is full of historical omissions and historical gaps and unverified speculation.
And the reinvention trope.
Well, reinvention places the agency in the hands of the interpreter. And what I attempted to show in the article is that methodology could be applied to anyone, and could be applied nefariously if one was so inclined. But I mean, the trashing of everyone that Manning does, Betty Shabazz and Alex Haley, in addition to Malcolm, and the self-righteousness with which he puts himself forward as someone now who's going to give the world a real story. And there is, in fact, hardly nothing that's really new. The assassins were identified in 1992 and 93. In fact, earlier, when Talmadge Hayer with Bill Kunstler was fighting for a new trial, he identified the other 4 people, and that information was published in Zach Condo's book Conspiracies, and was also published in most of it was published in Carl Evans's book, The Judas Factor: Who Killed Malcolm X. And there's lots of attribution. There are lots of borrowings from other people in Manning's book that are not attributed. He borrows heavily from Evans. Evans's book on The Messenger, Evans's book, he borrows heavily from Make It Plain. It is just truly unfortunate he is not here to explain himself.
Yeah. Let me shift back to something that we wanted to cover and skipped over, the not small question of SDS. And
yeah, I had. The SDS had had good relations with the original NSM, and I met them. We had a joint conference in Ann Arbor at some point, and I think later 63 in Ann Arbor. And then SDS went into community organizing as well. Junius was in Newark. And we said, what are you guys doing? Trying to copy our shit. And then they did ERAP too. I mean, they tried, Stanley Aronowitz was one of the major ideologues. They were trying to organize on an economic basis, and then they were trying to do community organizing, the most famous of which, was in Newark. But we came to a little parting of the ways, because the first racial division of labor in the movement, as far as I can tell, was what we did in NSM years before SNCC. In fact, there's a famous, not famous, it was famous to me, when SDS people and Cortland of SNCC were telling me that what NSM had done was not appropriate because we were all supposed to be one big happy family. But what I had discovered going up to Harlem one day, one evening, that the white girls were there with the dudes, and they were sitting down on these mattresses in the basement, like on 157th Street, and they were drinking wine and singing wobbly songs. And then they would take them down to Peter Buttenwieser's house. You look up Buttenwieser. He was a major force in terms of America's involvement in Vietnam. He also was a zillionaire, but they were exposing them to a life they could never have. They were exposing, and then you couldn't do anything with them after. So what we did, NSM remained interracial. I just said no more white girls organizing in the ghetto. So we still had white males working. Frank Joyce was the director of the Detroit Project. Sam Lake and folk worked with me, and others. There was still an interracial presence in NSM. I just said no more white girls in the ghetto. And that was in '64, I think. Then SNCC had an Atlanta. Then it's a problem about consciousness. Why do white people come, to join the struggle? And what's their idea of struggle? Many of them remain American nationalists at heart. And they want to, end poverty. They want to end the symptoms. And then some, for example, when I was in Mississippi, we were going to take people to register to vote. And this white girl wanted to hold my hand, as a demonstration of we shall overcome, or togetherness, or we're going to defeat these crackers. I said, I can't tell you what I said. But what I ended up saying, are you crazy? Because white people don't understand what other white people are capable of. So she's gonna hold my hand as a symbol of we're gonna defeat these people, not realizing she could get us both killed. So it's that, how do people become acquainted with the J. Edgar Hoovers of the world and the Klan of the world? They just have no idea about what this country, what some Americans are capable of. And so I just said no more white girls in the ghetto. And in fact, I wrote it's in Charlie Cobb's book, because I've been pilloried, racist dog, and whatever. I said, no, this was the reality of, let us suppose, what was this whole notion of we must love one another. And I said, it's the Cold War, and we are facing the destruction of humankind, and we are against nuclear weapons. So we are marching against the bomb. Are you asking the person who is marching with you against the bomb to love you? It's necessary. Why must they love you? Why must you appreciate? Why must we bend down and kiss your foot because you have come to help us in our struggle? Right? So you had to separate the wheat from the chaff in terms of white supporters, who was real, people who may have meant well, but they didn't, or as Bevel once said, we had high hopes, but we didn't know what we were up against.
Harding's made that point too, I guess.
No, Vincent's a Mennonite. He loves everybody. Yeah.
Let me ask a final thought from my end. How'd you read the Obama election?
I thought it was a potential turning point for America. I didn't get ecstatic about it because the same percentage of white people who voted for McCain had voted for Bush in 2004. And the only reason Obama won is black people turned out in Virginia and I think and Florida and North Carolina 98, 99%, so he could win the electoral vote. But it did appear. I mean, friends of mine in Spain and in Europe, everybody thought this because remember, he appeared to be the quintessential anti-Bush. And the world hated Bush. Donald Duck maybe could have won had he won. So it seemed like maybe it was, and then what he, in his campaign, the things he was saying, it looked like the possibility of real change.
We bring back to final thought you mentioned, you talked earlier about media and the construction of culture and the construction of what passes as history and consciousness and all. And I'm just interested a little bit in, if you could talk a little bit about your perspective on what you regard as a really well considered Black Studies curriculum.
Well, it's what I think now is not what I thought, not what I thought before, precisely because of the changes that have occurred. The Black Studies per se, to paraphrase Stokely, is necessary, but it is no longer sufficient. We are all on a ship called America. And if the ship goes down, whether we are first class, working with the captain, or in steerage, we all go down together. And America is going on its way to hell. We are the greatest debtor nation in the history of the world. The people who are supposed to, Obama et al., who are supposed to confront the problem, cannot confront the problem because they won't admit what the real problem is. You paid more taxes than General Electric and Bank of America. Corporations pay 6.6% of the federal budget. The masses pay, out of income tax and payroll taxes, contribute 84%. And now they're laying off the public sector, so the revenues will decrease. We have a $15 trillion debt. We pay $1 trillion on interest on the debt, which is never discussed. So what do they do? All this discussion yesterday and today about Geithner and the G20. The Fed is like a monopoly game. Print money, print money, print money, print money, but it cannot last. And so the people who understand that it cannot last, what happens when the dollar is no longer the international reserve currency? See? What happens? This cannot last unless, and the jobs are not coming back. The 3 million jobs are not coming back when you subsidize corporations to export jobs. The system is so corrupt. You have a little group called ALEC that meets with the corporation and politicians. They've written 800 laws. There's nobody in Congress writing laws for the public interest. And so when you ask about Black Studies, we are now in a different era because America was built upon the exploitation of the confiscation of Indian land and the exploitation of black labor until the Industrial society. So immigrants, white immigrants could come and they could get these jobs. But now, they exploit you too. Yeah, okay.
We're back.
We're coming
Yeah.
up.
So I mean, this is the problem. There's no real discussion of the real problems, and therefore there's no real solutions are being put forward. Just print more money, or because the same people have the same perspective globally as here in America, the only solution they have is so-called austerity. That means screw the public sector, but that cannot work. So we have, white family income. Black people are disposable. We are now irrelevant. And increasingly larger numbers of white people are now economically irrelevant. And they don't care about education. When Reagan came to office, they wanted to get rid of the Department of Education. All they care about is privatizing education, as they privatize prisons, as they want to privatize Social Security, as they want to privatize Bush privatized 25% of the IRS, which people don't know. So when I had a grad student, and they audited her. She made $22,000. They audited her. They don't audit, but as Buffett said, they don't audit Buffett. And they didn't audit. We now find out the SEC destroyed 9,000 documents of investigation, and we now find out that the general counsel of the SEC had $2 million invested in Madoff. Corruption with a capital K. So how do we, and what have they done? When you ask about Obama, Obama's irrelevant because they have infiltrated all of the agencies. The foxes are in the hen house, in the SEC, in the NLRB, in the FAA. You flew here in a plane 35 years old, monitored by an air traffic control system also 35 years old. And they privatized the subcontractors to take care of the planes. No. Everywhere you look, there is corruption and money über alles. But these people are different historically, because one can make a case that slavery is logical, that one can make a case that feudalism is logical. But these forces, they have let loose forces that they cannot control, and they don't care. They don't care about the ozone depletion. So what? And you have a clown like Rick Perry, who doesn't believe in climate change, while 78% of his state is on fire and under drought, and cows are dying. These people are mad. We are in the hands of idiots and maniacs and racist corruption. And I do not understand why there's not a revolution in this country. But there is no opposition that will explain to people what are the problems and what must be done. That's why, as I say about black people, just because our cause is just like the Indians does not mean we will triumph. No. And America is going steadily, People all around the world, America's lost its credibility. We're on the wrong side of every question. It's unbelievable. But of the American people, what are they? They're watching reality television and Fox News and Shrek 2.
Shrek 5 now.
Is it Shrek 5 now? Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Could I, before we go,
Yeah,
Yeah.
we're back on, and during the quick break, Bill, we wanted to ask you just to stretch out and say a little bit more about the rationale and the argument that led you to move white women out of the project of urban organizing.
Well, there was the singing of the wobbly songs. That was their legacy. That was their notion of politics. But you cannot. But you don't drink wine with people whom you're organizing. It's just like you don't have sexual relations with people whom you're organizing. Although there were some people who believed that you had to make out with everybody, ugly women as well as good-looking women. So you across the not an arc thing, but a SNCC person, a SALC person whom I will well, it was Bevel actually, whose predilections of, were exposed on foot at the end of his life. Terrible revelations about Bevel. So, and taking them down to the east side, and then you have to go back to Harlem.
Oh, they took the people that were organizing back to their homes on the east
Down to meet people like, go look up after this who Peter Buttonweasel was.
Yeah.
side.
See, they're exposing them to something that had nothing to do with struggle.
Well, that's kind of like the Tom Wolfe film, Radical Chic, where the Black Panthers were taken to all the East Side parties in New York and to raise funds, but it was again a similar kind of tension.
Yeah. Well, I had a problem with with the Panthers. Because actually it was the white left and the European left that has lionized the Panthers. Which is not to say some of them, but I had guys who, because as we said before about the relationship between the black community and the police, to confront the police, to try and organize against the police is quite logical and was important. But they got friends of mine who were in the Jersey City Panthers, they got killed. Cops just like they killed Fred Hampton and Mark Clark. So that if you're going to, speaking as an ex-Marine, if you're going to take on the enemy, understand what you're doing. You don't announce, hello, I'm going to be out at 4:30, right? That we're parading, and we're going to get you, or we're going to pretend to get you. I mean, so people don't. It's like people do not understand what a real confrontation with the police would entail. As I said, if I had had my platoon in Detroit, we could have taken over the city because the cops were shooting each other. They didn't know what they were doing. An organized group, we could have taken over the city. We couldn't have held it, but we could have taken it for a day and a half. But just like, there is no theory of change in America because America is the best of all possible worlds. All we have are blips that we can correct, a little blip here, a little blip there, but there's no concept that the whole, as Martin said, that the whole thing must be done away with. So we have yet to have, people may talk about Marxism, may talk about this and that, but we've yet to develop, and that's something that Malcolm was working on, something that Boggs was laying out, but Malcolm was working on. How do you really affect change in this country? And he put forward, as I wrote it in the article, he put forward two things, nationally and internationally. Ballot of the Bullet was the national strategy, but hooking up with and exposing through the UN and elsewhere, hooking up with international struggles. He was invited to Algeria in March of '65. He and Che, Ben Bella had invited them both to a conference in Algiers. So he was conveniently killed 2 and a half weeks before leaving for Algeria.
Bill, it's been a real privilege and an honor, and thank you for such a thoughtful and extensive commitment. Are there any final thoughts or?
I'll think of 1,000 things later. People I left out, people I should have mentioned.
Sure.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, well, thank you.
No, thank you.
It's been a great privilege.
Because people have been asking me to do a memoir, and one of the things, I've been lucky enough to meet some great people, and being able to explain from my limited viewpoint the significance of those people, as I tried to do with Malcolm, is what make me sit down and write this memoir called Once Upon a Time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture.